Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming and welcome to Jung and Trauma. This is our free introductory course titled Trauma and Complex. And so in this class, we're going to talk about the role of the complex in understanding trauma, and sort of from that, I think a lot of other ideas will be connected. We're going to begin by looking at some Jungian ideas around trauma, including the idea of the trauma complex and how a trauma complex will block the natural development of the individuation process. And we'll also look at how the Jungian approach to the inner world of trauma lacks really an important focus based on more recent research on the body. The body stores a lot of trauma. It's in the central nervous system. And when we just do talk therapy and things like that, we don't get at the body. We do a top-down, and a lot of specialists now they don't want to eliminate the top-down, but they want to include the bottom-up. And it's, of course, we do that in depth psychology, looking for the unconscious to come up, but we need to consider the body as a part of the unconscious when we're doing that. So then we're going to talk a lot more about that today and throughout the course. So we're also going to look at some of the most effective contemporary approaches to treating trauma, and then we're going to close the class with just a little survey of what we're going to cover in the full 8-module course on Jung and Trauma that starts next week. So, and if you're joining us, please do remain muted. And also, I didn't put this in my notes, but I just want to say, and I'll try to say this a couple times, this is an extremely sensitive and volatile topic. If you're someone who's been traumatized, and there could be things in this class and in this course that would be triggering, and if you're trying to work on trauma, depending on the severity of the trauma, it's really important to have a safe place to do the work, a safe person who you trust to do the work with, if you want to work when you're in a place to work with someone. So I can't reiterate that kind of thing enough, how safety and sensitivity around these topics and being aware of triggers, and we're going to talk about triggers and arousal and dysregulation and how to today we're just going to talk on a little bit about how to kind of try to regulate the arousal that gets triggered in trauma. But anyways, just as a bottom line, that's very, very important when we're talking about trauma on any level. So, and before we get into all of that, I just want to say a word about what these courses are, or how they've come to be. This course, this is the introductory class for the course on trauma, and it's produced through the Depth Psychology Academy in coordination with the Depth Psychology Alliance. And we always try to make available at least one free class with every course or seminar that we present, just in an effort to fulfill our mission, which is to make depth psychology available to everybody. And our full college-level courses, as well as our seminars, are designed to provide reasonably priced college-level material on topics related to Jung and Jungian depth psychology. So when you register for any of our courses, you're supporting the work of both the Depth Psychology Academy and the Depth Psychology Alliance. And so if you haven't done that already, I encourage you to visit both the www.depthpsychologyacademy.com website and the www.depthpsychologyalliance.com website. It's free to register on both sites, and on the Depth Psychology Academy site, you'll see there's many free classes that you can take, no charge. You just have to register and go through and see which one appeals to you. And of course, there's some free classes on YouTube. So with that little pitch out of the way, I want to begin on today's topic of trauma and complex. And so we want to define terms. What exactly is trauma? Well, according to Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed, who you're going to hear a lot about throughout this course, the word trauma refers to any experience which causes unbearable psychic pain. That is psychic. When we use the word psychic in Jungian psychology, which means of the psyche, we're not talking about clairvoyance or anything, but unbearable psychological pain or anxiety. And for an experience to be unbearable, it means that it overwhelms the usual defense measures that the psyche has available to it. And he says, quote, trauma of this magnitude varies from acute, shattering experiences of child abuse so prominent in the literature today to the more cumulative traumas of unmet dependency needs that mount up to devastating effect in some children's development. It means little bit of indignation throughout a lifetime, particularly a lifetime of a child, can be in many ways, if it's buried and not let out, can be as shattering as some of the other types of trauma. Now he's speaking here, Kalshed is speaking primarily of childhood trauma, which can be particularly devastating, but there is a range of different types of trauma and a range of different intensities of the trauma. Someone who's been in a car accident can experience debilitating trauma, but someone who's experienced repeated beatings or incest or other abuses in childhood will have an experience of trauma which is much more intense and much more challenging to treat. And that's the kind of thing, as I say, it's really vital that there be a safe place, working with safe people, and that one learns how to deal with the triggers that come up when you've been traumatized. So to have a general understanding of the Jungian approach to trauma, we're going to need to understand some basic ideas of Jungian psychology. And I know many of you probably already do have some ideas, but there are many people who don't. So I just want to try to quickly cover some things. I'll go into a little more depth on complex than I will on individuation. But the first of those ideas I want to discuss is the process of individuation, and the second idea is the idea of the complex. Well, individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. And the idea of the individuation process is really that of a process of psychological maturation. And this sort of diagram on the right, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that now, but that's a sort of a Jungian diagram of the psyche, and this differentiation deals with the persona and the ego from the unconscious, and as I say, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And now Jung says, quote, "The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of and the small s, that's the personality self, of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other," close quote. And when he says primordial images, that's especially in his early writings, he would use that as a sort of a synonymous with archetype. Suffice that to say. So there are essentially two stages of the process of individuation. The first stage is the task of the first half of life, and it involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation, which is this persona I was just speaking about, finding a mate, developing a work path, being able to support oneself, finding a place in society, and essentially just developing a strong ego structure, a personality self-structure. Now, in the process of doing this, and in the process of developing the persona, there's some things that don't help us to adapt, that we don't want in the persona, and they tend to fall into what Jung calls the shadow. So there's sort of already there's a split, a little dissociation in the psyche. And so the second stage then involves integrating this shadow and learning to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious, and especially the archetype of the self. And as I say, that's represented in the diagram. We won't have to, there's so much to cover, we won't have time to go deeply into all of the nuts and bolts of the Jungian psyche. Hopefully, I know many of you are familiar with some of these terms already. If you're not and you want to really dig into Jung, Murray Stein's wonderful book, Map of the Soul, is very useful, and we use that as a textbook for our course Jung 101, which is another way to kind of dig into those things. So Jung focused a great deal of his energy on this second stage, studying this second stage where there's a process of reintegrating what's been split off so that the psyche is at least less dissociated than it had been. Now, to describe the individuation process in this way, it's kind of glibly. It sounds pretty simple and uncomplicated. However, it's very, very difficult. Jung has said that the experience of individuation can feel like a crucifixion. It takes a long, long time. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of focus. It can be extremely mentally and emotionally painful and distressing to kind of balance the tension of the opposites, and the opposites being what's in the unconscious, and trying to bring that up into consciousness. And this is particularly painful and difficult when the natural development of this process of individuation has been interrupted by trauma. either in childhood somewhere or somewhere else in the process of the maturation of the psyche. There was a movie at one time, or actually a book first, I think, called Girl Interrupted, and that is an apt description of what happens when trauma bursts into the psyche in a way that just stymies this natural development of individuation. Now, in order to understand a little bit about trauma and how these kind of things intrude into the psyche, I want to talk about the complex. And according to Jung, a complex is, quote, the image of a certain psychic situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is moreover incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. This image has a powerful inner coherence, it has its own wholeness, and in addition, a relatively high degree of autonomy. That is, it operates independent of the ego, so that it is subject to the control of the conscious mind only to a limited extent, and therefore behaves like an animated foreign body in the sphere of consciousness. The complex can usually be suppressed with an effort of will, but not argued out of existence, and at the first suitable opportunity it reappears in all its original strength, close quote. And we'll say a lot more about that, but that gives you kind of a broad sense, a technical sense of what the complex is. But another really wonderful definition of the complex, I think, and if you want to know more about the complex, Jung has an essay on the complex theory, but there's a book from Inner City Books by Errol Shalit, the late Israeli Jungian analyst, who called, I'm not sure the whole title, but it's on the complex. It's a wonderful book. He defines the complex in this way. He says, quote, complex denotes a network of associations, images, ideas, memories, or the like, clustered around a nuclear archetypal core of meaning and characterized and held together by a common emotional tone. Thus, the complex embodies three elements: an archetypal core, around which personal experiences cluster, and an emotional tone that serves as the gravitational force that holds this microcosm together. So looked at in this way, the complex is like an onion. As we work on a complex, we peel away one layer at a time until we get to the core. That is, we work on dreams, we do active imagination, we differentiate a little bit more and a little bit more each time the conscious awareness of what's in the complex from the unconscious. And from this perspective, first we'll encounter symptoms, then we'll encounter personal experiences which are often related to an early trauma, and then there's an archetypal core. And the archetypal core will first appear as mythic images that can usually be amplified by cultural material. And there's a lot there. We're going through a lot to try to get through. As I say, I want to lay out some of the Jungian understanding of complex from the inner look, and then look at the neurobiological, which kind of looks at the outer, the structure of the brain and all that kind of stuff, and see how we can fit these things together. So I won't be able to go into as much detail here as I would like, but this makes it a little bit easier to understand. I think this is another view of the onion. You see there's surface symptoms on the outside layers of the onion. There are associated experiences, which may be, as Jung would say, a moral dilemma may come up that just doesn't fit into consciousness, or maybe an actual trauma. And then there's an archetypal core, because these experiences cluster around the numinous energy of these archetypes for reasons that we don't have time to go into. But I think that's enough to give you a general idea of what's going on with the archetypes. So one of the main characteristics of a trauma is its autonomous nature, just like a complex. Its ability to cause an individual to act in a way that is contrary to their conscious intentions. Now, as Jung says, quote, complexes are psychic fragments which have split off owing to traumatic influences or certain incompatible tendencies. Complexes interfere with the intentions of the will and disturb the conscious performance. They produce disturbances of memory and blockages in flow of associations. They appear and disappear according to their own laws. They can temporarily obsess consciousness or influence speech and action in an unconscious way. In a word, complexes behave like independent beings, a fact especially evident in abnormal states of mind. And when he says they appear and disappear according to their own laws, one of the basic laws of this is if the energy, if the psychological energy, the psychic energy, the psychological energy of the complex exceeds the psychological energy of the conscious will, the conscious intention, then the complex will intrude itself. A person, often we see a person very functional at work, get things done, everybody loves them, they're, hail fellow, well met, and all that sort of stuff. And they get home and they relax, whew, I'm tired, day's done, and that conscious will, the energy dissipates. And exactly that moment is when the energy of the complex now has more energy than the energy of the conscious will, and a wife comes in or a child comes in and something, and the guy blows up, throws something, starts to drink, because now the complex has more energy than the conscious will to hold the complex at bay. So some type of traumatic memory is often expressed via an archetype at the core of the complex. However, in the cases of severe trauma, especially early childhood trauma, the archetypal core of the trauma consists of a dyad. One part is the most wounded part, which has been overwhelmed by the trauma event, and the other part of the dyad we might call the survivor part, the part that has to kind of grow up fast and function. And the survivor part, which is what Donald Kalshed calls the daimonic aspect of the archetypal self-care system, this survivor part seems to have an original intention of protecting the wounded part. However, over time, the survivor part can get out of control and may actually take on the characteristics of a perpetrator, and then re-traumatizing the wounded part of this dyad, which is at the inner core of the complex, of the trauma complex. So as a result, as we peel away layers of a trauma complex, it's much more complicated, much more intense, much more painful than doing depth psychology work on most other more, say, like moral dilemma type complexes. I mean, they're all painful and difficult, but the trauma has extra affect, which is emotion, extra energy around it. So the pain and intensity of the work we do on trauma will, of course, always be relative to the severity of the trauma, and also how long the trauma went on. There's all these different factors that will make the work more difficult, because it makes the trauma be more imprinted in the deep structures of the psyche. Now, up to this point, you'll notice that I've been describing a typical depth psychology approach to thinking about the psyche. We've been looking at what Donald Kalshed calls the inner world of trauma. And as Jungians, this is what we do. If you're interested in Jung, then you're interested in dreams, you're interested in looking at fantasy images and myths, and we look at all the dynamics that occur within the inner world of the psyche. However, when it comes to trauma, contemporary research has now shown that the psyche's reach into the body is particularly important. It reaches everywhere. The central nervous system, the original purpose of the real purpose of the central nervous system, the brain and the central nervous system, is to move the organism to find food, to move the organism to find a mate, to move the organism to find shelter, to bond with other, or form tribes and groups so they can protect themselves from the world. This is the purpose of the central nervous system. And so what goes on in the body is really a part of the unconscious, and the body often stores traumatic memories that cannot be accessed simply by talking about it. And this has been very much studied just in the last several decades. So it's true that some practitioners of depth psychology do incorporate bodily movement in their practice, but most do not, certainly many do not. Most depth psychology work is done through the old model of talk therapy. Sometimes talk therapy can be very useful. Other times it can actually be a block. It can cause problems. Constantly telling the same story over and over again may tend to keep someone in their head, It does not help a survivor to integrate the thinking cognitive area of the brain with the trauma impulses, which are stored in the limbic system and in the deeper levels of the central nervous system that stretch like little rivers out into the entire body. So we're also going to be talking a lot about trauma specialist Bessel van der Kolk, and he says, quote, "It depends on how much," when we're talking about whether talk therapy is going to be helpful or not, he says it depends on how much secrecy there is. Like after a car accident or after 9/11, telling that story one more time is probably not all that helpful because we all know what happened. And there are no secrets, and nobody is blaming anybody for anything. But if you grew up in a household where your loyalty toward your caregivers prevents you from telling the truth, being able to say what really happened what happened back in the past, back then, and finding words for what this little kid was experiencing is incredibly powerful." Close quote. So the point is, depending on where you are in the process and what kind of trauma, and we're going to talk later about attachment theory and how the role that plays, so what kind of attachments are involved, talking about it is not always as helpful as getting it out of the body. And that's talking about it can be extremely helpful at different phases, and sometimes it's essential, but it depends on where we are in the process. That's the top-down approach, and the approach that starts with the body is what they call a bottom-up approach. So, although talk therapy can be very powerful, especially Jungian therapy, it can leave out this vital element of connecting up the bodily emotions with the cognitive thinking centers of the brain. What Jungians do is we work on complexes, and we work towards developing an ego-self axis, which opens up a channel between the deep unconscious and ego consciousness. Typically, however, these approaches to developing an ego-self axis do not place enough emphasis on the body, on body movement, or on an integration between the trauma impulses stored in the body, the trauma impulses stored in the emotional brain, and bringing all those impulses into conversation with the thinking cognitive centers of the brain. This is a sort of a bottom-up way of thinking about this ego-self axis, where when we think of it this way, for me anyways, I like to think of it as this, instead of just thinking about the psyche being a part of this ego-self axis, the whole body, the whole organism needs to be a part of this ego-self axis, where this flow of energy can happen without obstruction. That's the thing with the complexes, it blocks the energy, and with the trauma complex, lots and lots of energy gets blocked there, and often it robs us of so much energy we sometimes can't get anything done. But if that ego self-axis has the energy flowing, especially through the body, then a lot of energy can be made available. So contemporary research has shown that trauma stored in what used to be called the limbic system, they don't call it the limbic system so much now, because it was called the limbic system because it was thought that everything worked as a unified system, and now there are people who are questioning that. But most people still use the term limbic system just because that's how we understand this interconnected bunch of elements of the brain. So they've shown that trauma stored in the limbic system must be integrated with the cognitive centers of the brain if the trauma survivors are to be free from repetition compulsions, which keep them reliving their traumatic emotions. So in top-down, if we're just talking about it and thinking about it, and we're just going through all of the rehashing things and figuring things out, having insights, we're not necessarily reaching this limbic system level. And likewise, if we're just crying and getting, beating bataka bats and all that, but we don't integrate that with the thought processes, then we're stuck there. So the real trick, what they're saying now in modern treatment of trauma, and based on neuroscientific and neurobiological studies, getting all those systems connected and working together is the thing that really can help this to mitigate the constant returning to the past sort of spontaneously when these trauma complexes get triggered. So, as I said, the Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed is wonderful. We're going to have a lot to do with him throughout this course, and he's made wonderful use of many of Jung's insights, and he's really taken his work on trauma far beyond the work of Carl Jung. Jung didn't really focus on trauma. There hadn't been as much. Matter of fact, Freud focused a lot on trauma and said that there was always a trauma at the back of every single psychological issue. And Jung recognized that it wasn't always a trauma. A lot of people would get neurotic over various things that were not necessarily traumatic, or they were minor traumatic, or they could be, as we said before, a cumulative thing. But he didn't. So for that reason, he didn't spend a lot of time focusing on trauma. That's not to say he didn't. We're going to have a whole module where we're going to talk about just what he did have to say about trauma. But meanwhile, even though Kalsch has done all this work with, even beyond what Jung did on trauma, neurobiological research on trauma has exploded over the past several decades, really since the 90s, but particularly in the last couple of decades. But even with that, even Donald Kalshed, whose first book was in the late 90s, has not really integrated any of this neurological research into, or very little of it, into his work. And likewise, on the other hand, if you get deeply into people like Bessel van der Kolk and Pat Ogden and many different people who specialize in trauma from this sort of bottom-up neuropsychological way, their research on trauma is wonderful, but they have virtually no knowledge and no interest in the work of people like Jung or Jungians like Donald Kalshed. They have really no understanding of the valuable insights into trauma responses that can be achieved through exploring what we've been looking at, which is the inner world of trauma. They're involved in the structures of the psyche. They're involved in the structures of the brain, the whole pathway of the central nervous system. As I said, the reptilian, what they call the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, which is where this is what we call the limbic system, where the emotions tend to be housed, memories tend to be housed, and all this logical processing stuff. They know all that, but they don't really know a lot about how we can get at that stuff through dreams and active imagination and things like that. So in this upcoming course on Jung and trauma, what we're going to try to do is to integrate these approaches to trauma. And I have this full, full disclosure here. I'm definitely not an expert on the neuropsychology of trauma. I'm not an expert on trauma at all, really. If anything, I'm something of an expert on Jung, and I know a lot about trauma. I'm a trauma survivor myself, so I've been studying trauma since a time when there was very little written about trauma. So I'm very interested in trauma, so I know something about trauma, but I'm not an expert, and I'm going to. I don't know anyone who's done what I want to do in this course, and so I'm just kind of experimenting and thinking, and I'm very interested in feedback from people as we go through the course, because as I say, I know Donald Kalshed's work is brilliant, it's wonderful, but he's not including a lot of this body stuff, and Bessel van der Kolk's and some of these other people's, their work is brilliant, and I know there's a way to bring them together. Now I know for example, there's a Jungian named Joan Chodorow, who does active imagination with dance, with body movement. And I know I don't want to say that there aren't other Jungians who are doing work with body movement. There are many. But just how we can sort of theoretically and systematically bring these two worlds together is not entirely clear to me, but I think some of that will emerge. Some of it has emerged even as I've just been preparing the course. And I'm going to have some ideas that I think will be useful. And we'll be working on this, trying to bring these two things together as we go through. So by bringing the Jungian approach to trauma, through looking at the trauma complex and what Kalshed calls the archetypal self-care system, and looking at the trauma complex and how that interrupts what Jung would call the natural individuation process, we'll explore the inner world of trauma. They're looking at it through dreams, through active imagination work, through looking at things internally. By studying the neurobiology of trauma, the physiological implications of trauma, and the role of attachment in trauma, we'll explore how trauma impacts the physical body and how working with the physical body can be a powerful way to relieve and sometimes even resolve trauma and traumatic symptoms. And it can also, one thing that I do know is that as we work with the body and it releases and it gets things more connected to the cognitive centers of the brain, these three levels of the brain, when they're all working in tandem well, we get more dreams. We get more interesting dreams. We get things that are more of a benefit to the individuation process, which is, in itself also is designed to try to get all of these systems working together. So the energy is flowing along what Eric Neumann and Edward Edinger have called the ego-self axis. So according to Bessel van der Kolk, he says, quote, "We can now develop methods and experiences that utilize the brain's own natural neuroplasticity to help survivors feel fully alive in the present and to move on with their lives." There are fundamentally three avenues, and we've talked about the top-down. Number one, he says, is top-down, by talking, reconnecting with others, and allowing ourselves to know and understand what is going on with us while processing the memories of the trauma. And that's important. He's not saying that isn't important, even though he puts a lot of emphasis on some of the new research. But he's saying that this is one of the three ways that's recognized as being helpful. And of course, another is by taking medicines that shut down inappropriate alarm reactions, or by utilizing other technologies that change the way the brain organizes information. And now, for me personally, I'm not in favor of a lot of drug therapies for doing this kind of work. But if someone's been extremely, combat trauma and repeated rape and really, really brutal childhood trauma, the brain, we were talking about the triggering of the brain just keeps firing. This amygdala and these different systems in the limbic system, different organs in the limbic system, they keep firing, and sometimes it takes some kind of a profound intervention like drugs to just stop it from firing, to calm the person down enough that they can actually do some of these other therapies. So it is, depending on the severity, as I've said, it can be very, very essential. So, and the third is, of course, what we've been calling the bottom-up system, which is by allowing the body itself to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, rage, or collapse that result from trauma. In other words, that rage and helplessness and sense of collapse, which is the freeze response, or the hypoarousal, they call it, this deadening, that when we get in touch with the body, when we listen to the body, when we're quiet and allow the body to move and have these experiences, that those things will begin to come up, and it can help to release things into a place where we can then process the memories and all that. So he says, which one of these three is the best for any particular survivor is an empirical question. It means you need to just see the context of the person's life and where they are in their recovery and all that. But he says that most people I have worked with require a combination, either a combination of all of them or a combination of some balance of these different modalities. So you can see number one in van der Kolk's list, which is top-down, by talking and reconnecting. This is a category where most Jungian work often takes place. However, when he says that, he says maybe about talking, about reconnecting, about doing different things in a sort of a cognitive way, but he's leaving out, and apparently because he's unaware of, certainly most mainstream psychologists are unaware of just what can be learned from the Jungian understanding of the archetypes, which emerge through dream work and active imagination. He leaves out working with dreams, working with the inner world in that way of the psyche, and doing these things can also help us track where in the body trauma may be found. There's stories about Jung working with people who had a dream about either some organ or some, I forget exactly what the details are, but then the person would go to the doctor and find out, indeed, the dream told him about a tumor that he had, and he might have died had the dream not alerted him to this thing. So, and I'm not saying that's going to happen with everybody, but this is the kind of thing that we can find out from doing work on the inner world of trauma. Particularly, you can see how this could be really beneficial if we could combine that somehow with some of this bottom-up work. So again, this kind of work can include dream work, active imagination, as well as active imagination techniques, which specifically focus on body movement. It would be dance or any number of different things. According to all contemporary research, effective treatment of trauma will also include some form of body work. And that would include yoga, martial arts, tai chi, qigong, etc. And Bessel van der Kolk's clinic has done studies on people doing yoga, and they found, in tandem with this, recovery work that they're doing for trauma, and doing yoga was more effective than any of the pharmacological treatments. In other words, he says in one of these interviews, he says that he's surprised that all of the pharmacology units of trauma units haven't been shut down and turned into yoga classes, because they're more effective than using drugs of any kind. Anyways, leave it at that. And the key to any of these things, if we're going to use yoga, if we're going to use martial arts or tai chi or qigong, the key is to process the memories, the grief, and other traumatic residue which emerge from the body, from the movement, when you're doing these movements, and to be able to simultaneously, consciously discuss and process verbally and cognitively the traumatic memories and emotions with another person. In other words, it's not good enough to just talk about it, and it's not good enough to just do some kind of movement thing, although the movement can be very, very useful even on its own. But the important thing is that all these systems are in communication with each other, that I be able to verbalize what's going on in the body, that I'm aware of it, and I can feel it. I can tolerate the very difficult emotions that come up, and then I can say something about it. And then doing this over and over again, you develop these skillful means of connecting all these different systems, and that's the whole potato, really. And it's sort of a parallel. This is sort of a parallel to what I've been calling the ego-self axis, what Neumann calls the ego-self axis, which is sort of an inner world way of understanding, connecting all these systems. So the goal here, the goal here is to integrate the body with the emotional brain, as well as the emotional brain with the thinking, cognitive areas of the brain. Now, one can see this process of connecting the deeper areas of the brain with the thinking areas of the brain, as I say, as a parallel to the Jungian idea of the ego-self axis. And with the idea of the ego-self axis is that the numinous energy that's blocked by complexes can be freed up and made available. If we don't make it available, we either become inflated because it's unconscious, we become inflated. We think we're one of the gods because we have all this psychological energy unconsciously populating our psyches. And otherwise, if that doesn't happen, and we're not, this ego-self-axis isn't happening, then we're alienated from we become depressed. If you look at the diagnostical and statistical manual, all of the, Jungian would say that all of the anxiety disorders are related to being inflated by an archetype, and all of the depressive disorders are about being alienated from the archetype. We have no flattened affect. It means no emotion, completely no energy to do anything. Everybody else has got the energy. We become obsessed with the celebrities and other people because they've got all this psychic energy, all this numinous energy, but I have none. So the ego-self-axis idea is a way to slowly allow ourselves to have access to those energies without being either inflated by them or alienated from them. So now another aspect of trauma and how severely trauma is experienced by the individual is related to the idea of attachment and attachment theory. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on attachment theory. Really one of the most important theories in modern psychology, one of the only really scientifically proven theories, is attachment theory. Attachment theory recognizes the evolutionary importance of human beings being connected with one another, to another being. There are many different types of trauma, but when trauma is experienced at the hands of someone we are attached to, especially in the way that a child is attached to a parent, then the effects of the traumatic experience can be much more severe and much more difficult to process, even in later adulthood. Sometimes this amounts to what's called betrayal trauma. And the idea of betrayal trauma is just that someone who you really put, very, very attached to, you find out has obviously betrayed you. And, so certainly there's few worse kinds of betrayal than, parental incest and beatings and, those kind. When it's someone that close, the betrayal is just monumental. And then studies also shown that when people have experienced that, they're much more likely to experience betrayal in relationships later in life, in adult life, because you're kind of drawn into those situations. So attachment is a basic evolutionary need. I mean, a normal person would just say love. Well, I love someone, I want more love, I need love, I need love. But it also is an evolutionary neurobiological need. A traumatized person who is strongly attached to a perpetrator will find it much more difficult to acknowledge the trauma and much more difficult to separate from the perpetrator in order to avoid future trauma. So we get, reenact, and even if you do separate, then, as I say, you tend to find another situation where it's repeated again, because you're longing, you need this biological attachment, and you tend to be attached to people who have these tendencies. So this type of interpersonal trauma creates a challenge for treatment because it subsequently becomes very difficult to establish a safe interpersonal relationship between therapist and client. And as I said, the can't overemphasize any kind of approach to working with trauma requires safety, trust, an enclosed container where a person can really feel that they're not going to be violated again. Whatever the violation was, whatever the fear is that is brought about by the trauma triggers, we want to try to be able to mitigate that as much as possible if you're going to be working with someone who's got trauma. A trauma history. So if you remember earlier, I quoted Jung speaking of complexes when he said that complexes, quote, produce disturbances of memory and blockages in the flow of associations. They appear and disappear according to their own laws. They can temporarily obsess consciousness or influence speech and action in an unconscious way. In a word, complexes behave like independent beings, a fact especially evident in abnormal states of mind. So when such an autonomous complex is driven by severe trauma, the results can be devastating not only for the survivor, but also for the survivor's family, for friends, for coworkers, etc. A trauma complex creates an overload of energy in the brain, and when that energy is not regulated, the person becomes hyper-aroused often. Sometimes they'll become hypo-aroused. They'll take to their bed, and hypo-aroused just means they're flattened affect. This is the alienated phase. Hyper-aroused is the sort of inflated stage. Hypo-aroused is the flattened affect stage. But in either case, the reason I'm saying it's friends, families, and coworkers are influenced is because of this attachment thing. When you're attached to people, or when I'm attached, for example, to a trauma survivor, or if you're attached to a trauma survivor, when they're triggered, it affects us. So everybody is affected. And we like to say when you work with, we can really change the world. We can change the world to a much, much better place if we could treat all of the trauma that's out there, because most perpetrators, and not to excuse perpetrators, but most perpetrators have been perpetrated upon, or at least perceive that they have been perpetrated upon. And so eliminating the effects of trauma will do a lot to make civilization and to make the world a much, much better place. So it's really important work to be doing. So these states that I'm talking about, these hyper and hypo-aroused states, are related to the fight, flight, freeze response in the central nervous system. When the trauma complex is triggered, the traumatized person lives in trauma time. They go back to that state when they were traumatized. And due to the neurological firings in the brain and the central nervous system, the person experiences themselves as being back in the time of the trauma. They may have new resources now. They may have more intelligence now. They may be a grown-up, mature person now. But when the trauma complex is triggered, they experience themselves once again as that person they were when they were traumatized. If they were a little kid, that's what they feel like. A person without resources, a person trapped by an overwhelming situation, experiencing overwhelming emotions, is the feeling of the person who's gone back in time because of this fight or flight trigger that's fired in their brain. So this is why any trauma treatment, as I've said, requires great patience, requires a safe environment, and requires the ability of the survivor and the person working with the survivor, to establish a trusting bond between two different people. And resolving trauma involves the sufferer learning new ways to respond to these types of triggers, learning to self-regulate when hyper-aroused, and learning to pull oneself out of the freeze state when they are hypo-aroused. The traumatized individual has to learn step by step to slowly expand their window of tolerance for the firings of the brain and to bring them back from the traumatized state of being triggered. And we call that self-regulating. One has to learn to, instead of whatever my sort of habitual response is to being triggered, if I'm traumatized, and I am, I was, it's kind of like being an alcoholic. I think you're always traumatized, but you can, if you can learn to self-regulate and learn to catch yourself when the triggers are coming, then you have a chance to, instead of lashing out at someone, you may turn to yoga. You may turn to some martial art, or Tai Chi, or Qigong, or interestingly, one of the things they call it a neuro. I think I have something on this coming up, but no, maybe not. But there's a thing they call neurofeedback, and which also is helpful in the same way that practices like yoga. And they found that one thing that really helps is musicians playing with other musicians, or doing anything where you're responding back and forth. You're having to respond to another person with bodily movements. And I play the drums and listen to backing tracks, and this is something that I can just feel my whole central nervous system calming down when I do that, because I'm doing lots of movement and I'm responding to the sounds that I'm listening to, and all of that is a sort of a self-regulating neurofeedback system, which is just it's much more pleasant for me than acting out, I can tell you. So that's a synopsis of the work we're going to be doing over the next 8 weeks of the full Jung and Trauma course. I know I've skipped over a lot of stuff. I've sped through a lot of things, but there's, as I say, there's a lot to cover. That's why it's an 8-week course. So our first goal in this course is going to be to expand our understanding of how to work with trauma from a Jungian perspective. And our second goal will be to discover ways to integrate some of these ideas from contemporary neuroscientific trauma research, integrate them into our Jungian approach to the inner world of trauma. So what I want to do now is just to conclude the class by going over what we're going to cover in the 8 modules of the upcoming course. And so start doing that in Module 1. We're going to survey some of Jung's thoughts on trauma, and we'll look at the approach of a number of different Jungians and how they understand trauma. So we're going to kind of ground ourselves in a Jungian worldview. And for those of you who would like to earn the certificate, you can earn a certificate of completion of this course. It doesn't give you CEUs or anything like that, but it's something. And our textbook is going to be Donald Kalshed's first book, The Inner World of Trauma, Archetypal Defenses of the Personal Spirit. You certainly don't need to. You can just audit, or just take the course and get out of it what you like. But if you want to take the quizzes, there's going to be a quiz on the lectures, on the videos, and there will be a quiz on the readings. And the readings won't go module to module. In other words, the first module isn't going to line up with chapter 1 or anything like that. But if you read them simultaneously, you'll get a lot out of it. The Kalshit book is not an easy book. It's fairly dense, but there's a lot of very, 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 very excellent material in there, and it will, even if you're not going to go for the certificate, you will get a lot out of. You get more out of the course if you're reading along with Kalshit, because a lot of what we talk about will be drawn in one way or another from what Kalshit has to say. So in Module 2, we're going to look more closely at the neurobiology of trauma. We're going to draw on a number of different sources, but our primary source for understanding contemporary approaches to trauma will be Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And again, if you don't want to take the full course and you just want to learn more about that, you can't do better than reading both the Kalshit book and this van der Kolk book are excellent. Now, there won't be anything in the quizzes or anything on van der Kolk, but excellent resource, good reading, and very grounded in most of the most recent studies in neuroscience of trauma. So in Module 2, we're going to look at what's going on in the brain when someone experiences trauma. We'll look at how to work with traumatic memory that's embedded in the nervous system, and we're going to discuss ways to help trauma survivors tolerate dysregulation and to come back from hyper and hypoarousal. And we'll also talk about neurofeedback and the benefits of interacting with others through sports, playing in bands, or any interaction with others which requires physical activity in response to another person. Again, the body's there, but the mind is being integrated with the body because it has to pay attention to what's going on. So that's a kind of neurofeedback. So in Module 3, we're going to discuss how to target the limbic system to reverse trauma's physiological imprint. This is the imprint that the trauma makes on and in the body. And we'll talk about why movement is such a critical part of healing and the treatment of trauma, and we'll talk about the neurobiology of attachment. We're going to spend really a lot of this module on attachment, and we'll discuss different attachment styles and how they can be impacted by trauma. In classical psychodynamic depth psychology, we're often looking for some kind of top-down insight, thinking that this is going to be the key to resolving the issue. However, that's left brain thinking. And with trauma, as well as other psychological states, it's often more important to get in touch with the right brain through bonding, through creating an authentic attachment, and connecting with another person. And so we'll talk about all of this in the context of attachment theory and trauma physiology in Module 3. Then in Module 4, we're going to get back into looking at the Jungian approach, and we're going to be talking in a lot of detail about Donald Kalshit's idea of the self-care, the archetypal self-care system. His theory is really, really important. It's certainly the most advanced that I've seen in Jungian psychology. As I say, he focuses on this archetypal self-care system, and this is this dyad we spoke of earlier, of the wounded, traumatized self on the one side and the archetypal survivor on the other side, sort of a daimonic survivor. In childhood trauma, the survivor child is the one who learns to get things done, how to protect the wounded part of him or herself, and to live productively in the world while sort of sheltering and keeping safe this wounded part. However, all the time this survivor work is going on and the survivor child is out there being efficient in the world, the child's soul is being hidden away and split off from consciousness, and eventually the survivor part, which at first is a protector, often actually begins to embody the persecutor and begins to re-traumatize the split-off, wounded part of the individual. And Kalshit shows some amazing ways in which this is revealed through dreams and other details of trauma survivors' lives. He uses case studies, people he's worked with. We're going to discuss his theory in detail, and we're going to see if there are ways that we can integrate what we've learned about neurobiology into our understanding of what Kalshit calls the inner world of trauma. And then in Module 5, he uses fairy tales a lot towards the second part of his book, uses them to great effect. So we're going to look at two different fairy tales, one in Module 5 and one in Module 6. We're going to look at, in Module 5, the famous tale of Rapunzel, and track the parallels to Kalsched's self-care system. It's a Grimm's fairy tale, and in this tale, Kalsched sees Rapunzel in her tower as the wounded part of the dyad of the self-care system, and the witch who keeps her in the tower is the survivor child, the protector and persecutor part of the self-care system. And then Module 6, we're going to look at trauma and fairy tales again with a Scandinavian tale called Prince Lindworm. And a lindworm, as you can see from this picture, is a kind of a snake-like, dragon-like creature. And in the story, a lindworm, or one of these dragon-type creatures, is born to a queen as one of two twin sons. The first son is this hideous monstrosity, a dragon-like serpent, and the second son is a perfect, whole, and beautiful son. This is a much longer story than the Rapunzel story, so we're going to have to edit it down. But there's a parallel to the self-care system with the wounded child and the persecutor protector in these twins, the perfect child and the monstrosity. And the main theme of this is the transformation of the lindworm, or the dragon creature, into a handsome prince at the hands of a clever maiden and an old crone who instructs the maiden how to behave and how to proceed with this dangerous creature who eats all of his other brides, but she manages to survive. It's a classic redemption motif tale, and it gives us additional insights into Kalsched's understanding of the self-care system. So, according to those are the two fairy tales we're going to look at. Then in Module 7, we're going to look at trauma and addiction. And according to the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, quote, adolescents with PTSD are 4 times more likely than, and PTSD is, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, they're 4 times more likely than adolescents without PTSD to experience alcohol abuse or dependence. They're 6 times more likely to experience marijuana abuse or dependence, and 9 times more likely to experience hard drug abuse or dependence. So in Module 7, we're going to look at trauma and addiction. Jung was closely involved with the development of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step movement. We're going to look at some of that, and we can easily see how this survivor part and the self-care dyad, the survivor part, might easily fall prey to alcoholism or other addictions in order to protect the wounded self, numb the pain of that wounded self, and numb the pain of the traumatic memories. So we're going to explore those ideas in more detail in Module 7. And then finally in Module 8, we're going to close the course by exploring trauma and the effects of trauma on a cultural level. The history of the world has been a history of trauma. It's only in modern times that human beings have had the luxury to notice that it was even possible to live without trauma. Life expectancy for not that long ago rarely reached past the mid to late 40s. And for much of human history, wars and social upheaval, disease, death in childbirth, violence in the family, incest in the family, all kinds of abuses were commonplace. And although today many people manage to make it through an entire lifetime with comparatively little experience of trauma, much of those traumas throughout history that plagued humanity in the past are still present. Just if you haven't seen the news recently and you don't want to be traumatized, then don't watch it anymore. So we see it on TV, we see it on the internet. In this module, we're going to look at the intergenerational and historical trauma that has gone on. We're going to explore ways to cope with the traumas around us and to do what we can to protect ourselves and our loved ones, to learn what we can do to protect ourselves and our loved ones from these kind of events and to heal from those traumatic events that we've already experienced. And that is everything I have to say about Jung and trauma for today. And I hope if you found that interesting that you will take a closer look and maybe join us for the course that starts next Saturday. You can sign up at www.depthpsychologyacademy.com. And now we are going to open it up to a discussion. So I hope you have thoughts or questions or contributions that you'd like to share. If I can, okay, here we go. So I see Doug has his hand up. Yes, sir. Doug, are you? Did you have a question? You're. I think you're muted. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize. Can you hear me now, James?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I had a stroke, so I have this. My eyes are not working together yet.
Uh huh.
Um, Thank you very, very much for all of this. It's incredible. I just a couple comments. I've been working with the vagus nerve. I'm
Uh
a
huh.
survivor of childhood sexual abuse.
Sure.
Been doing the vagus nerve work,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been profound because you've just explained to me why it's the way I've defined it is it unbinds the nervous system of the signature of compulsion.
Yeah. It
So,
relaxes that firing that I was talking about. It's the nerve that really is involved in all of that. If it's not, there's the what they call the sympathetic nervous system, which is doing the firing, and there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is connected to the vagus
okay.
nerve, and that does the calming down. Yeah, so that's one of the things that we'll talk about. Yeah, that's a very important way to
Well,
calm down the firing, the hyper and
I'm
arousal.
what I'm impressed with is how doing this vagus nerve work, and then what you're saying, how they are integrating things. And I'll
Hmm.
just give an example, just hoping that it might help somebody else out there. Um, I've struggled with suicidal thoughts most of my life, and it was only in the last, gosh, 6 months that I started to realize this is not a normal process. Like, so I haven't been in the garden because I had a stroke. It's been difficult, but I go out in the garden and I'm hard on myself because it's overgrown and everything. And the first thing that would come in, and this time I actually was able to see the thought arrive and experience the helplessness of the whole experience of, well, you're useless. And then it would go towards some kind of suicidal fantasy. Complex is what I now know from what you're saying. And it's just been an incredibly liberating experience. And I just
So
want to let
you're
people
learning
know.
you're learning to self-regulate.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah,
Sorry.
that's great.
Yeah, I'm learning to self-regulate, and it's this it's it's an incredible liberating experience to
Sure.
realize this thing I've been carrying most of my life, thinking it was my identity, is not. It's a complex, and it was brought about by various,
Well,
activities that I've done.
It's a complex, but it's also the complex is tied up with things that have been imprinted on your central nervous system. So it's
Right.
not. I mean, even if you cleared up the complex cognitively, thinking about it,
Mm,
figuring it out, until you do like you're doing with the vagus nerve, until you do the things with the body movements and all that tie these things up,
it,
those imprints in the body are going to continue to fire
got it.
and trigger those thoughts and that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm
So,
glad you've been able to do that, Doug. That's great.
oh, it's well, you guys have been a big part of it. I've loved everything you've offered, and I'm just trying to find the time to take all these courses.
Well,
Um,
you do what you can, and you have that's part of the whole process is learning to. You can't do everything. You have to do what you can do.
Correct. Now,
Yeah,
I have one question, and I
yeah.
think it relates to printing because in my process that I've been through, so it's been 7 months since the stroke, I've seen two neurologists various times, and I'm quite certain there was an imprinting that took place in my story.
Of course, yeah.
One of the things that happened, and I don't want to get into it. I just want to relate this thing because you might have an answer because I've asked neurologists this. No, none of them have had an answer for me. But essentially, what happened, I was at a very early age. I was exposed to all this pornographic material.
Hmm.
What happened to me physically, it felt like someone hit me with a baseball bat.
Hmm.
Like I'll never forget it. It was in a barber shop and there was pornography everywhere and all this. And I'm this young boy with five older sisters, very sensitive, the whole thing.
Sure,
And then
you were overstimulated. You're not meant at that age to be stimulated in that way. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm beginning to wonder because I suffered ADHD and I couldn't spell and I went through all of those classic, hyperactivity situations. But I'm just wondering, is that a possibility that you could have a neural, because the neurologists that I've talked to and I asked them about it, just because of this
They
exposure.
don't typically neurologists, unless they're tied in with like a trauma center or something like that. Typically, neurologists aren't going to have a lot of insight into, how you
Correct.
integrate your history and into all that stuff. You want to work with somebody who actually does have some background in that. But and it's not going to come from one event. It's not going to come from seeing pornography in a barbershop or something. But it's, as we're saying, cumulatively all these different
Hmm.
things, and for them to happen in a environment that's not safe. There's not a safe container. Having
No.
perhaps parents that are also dysregulating all the time. All those
Yep.
things are going to contribute to that kind of thing. And Doug,
But what?
I'd love to say more, but we've got other people who want to ask questions. But go ahead. Just yet one
Right.
more thing. What's that?
Well, I'm just wondering, like, is the physical reaction, is that sorry, possible thing with all of that? Because I just remember it felt like I got hit like a baseball bat. I was just spinning.
Yeah, no, your central nerve there. I mean, I would not be surprised to learn that there's other things in your childhood that had also caused you to have a panic or have a shock or something, and that could have triggered that. But yeah, it's absolutely possible that, particularly as I say, cumulative things will cause this trauma response to get triggered, and then it gets triggered over and over, and eventually it becomes a bit. The younger you are,
And
when the brain is being formed, when you're little, that's when the brain is growing and forming. So yeah, it can become more difficult to work it out, but it's not impossible, and it's great. The work you're doing with the vagus nerve is great. If you can, learn other things like yoga and stuff like that, just things that will get you with your integrating your thoughts about this, what you're learning about this, with ways to regulate that hyperarousal will be helpful. Thanks,
great.
Doug. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
bringing that up. Appreciate it. Okay, I see. Is it Vida or Vida? You had your hand up
Uh,
first.
yeah, Vida, Vida.
Vida,
Uh,
hi.
yeah, hi, how are you? Thank you so much. It was a very informative class. I learned a lot.
I'm glad.
My question is a little bit of a housekeeping. Is this class going to be recorded?
It's been recorded. It should be recording now. Yeah, it's recording now. If
What
everything
about
works
the
right,
following classes? Are they
all the
going to?
classes are recorded, and they're
Perfect.
all put up on the Depth Psychology Alliance, Depth Psychology Academy site. And if you sign up for the course, you access them through there. This one will also be put up on YouTube, just so people can have access
Thank
to it
you.
without having to go there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thanks
that.
for asking.
Sure.
Okay, Sky, I don't know who is next, but you're next on my screen there.
Uh, how are trauma-driven complexes in the collective psyche
Hmm.
determining world events?
Hmm.
And how can we integrate the content or the learning and release the complexes?
Well, to think that we can have an individual impact on the kind of traumas that are going on in, for example, Ukraine and Israel, would be an inflated expectation. But it's Jung said. People asked Jung, and there was, I think, in regard to nuclear holocaust. He said, "Are we going to survive? What's going to happen? Are we going to destroy ourselves?" And he said the only way out is for enough people to do inner work, and that means and he said many times that all the great transformations in the world, all the great change in the world, happened because of one person. And then one person, and there's a great one of my favorite chapters in Eric Neumann's book, Origins and History of Consciousness. He has a appendix called "The Group and the Great Individual," and he really describes that phenomenon, how a great individual will do some kind of move the collective consciousness a little bit farther ahead, and then other people see that. He constellates the potential for other people, and then other people change. So the most we can do is to change ourselves, and the little kindnesses we do everywhere. And as I was saying, just healing, every time we help someone heal from trauma, we're changing civilization. Meanwhile, around the world, other people are creating more and more and more and worse traumas. But the more we can affirm goodness and affirm the potential for healing and for kindness as a better tool than some of these crazy things people do, that's really all we have within our power. There's some forces in the world that are, unless we're, in some position of great influence, we just have to. For me personally, that's where prayer and a spiritual life comes in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking, Sky.
Okay, Rosemary, good luck and enjoy.
Vida, you got your I got you muted now. Okay, never mind. Paula, hi. Yeah, you have your hand up, Paula.
Well, I didn't really do that intentionally.
You didn't put the hand up intentionally. Oh, okay. Oh, so that's all right. That happens. But if you have a question, let me know. If not, anyone who has a question. So, did you have anything you want to ask or contribute?
Well, I did, but I was kind of embarrassed to bring it up. But
if you had the question, probably someone else has it too. So.
Well, no, I was thinking about my own case where I think that, I have eating problems. And I think that comes from being like the third child and one right after the other. And probably my mother being overworked and not getting enough, maybe nurturing. And so I think food was.
That's how you got love. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very common. Have you ever read or heard of Marion Woodman?
Yes.
Yeah, she has a lot of wonderful books on women and eating women and food, and she's a great resource if you're interested in learning more about a Jungian way to think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really didn't want to bring. I had the question, but I didn't really want to bring.
Well, what's the question? You described the situation, but you didn't have a question.
Well, I guess that wasn't really a question, but I just wanted, I guess, to confirm that that's a kind of a trauma.
It can. Well, it's definitely a trauma if you're always the. I mean, there's a lot of debate about how to actually categorize what's trauma and what's a big trauma, what's a little trauma. I mean, Kalshid talks about a little girl who their parents had just moved to a new house, and the neighbor came over, and she was so excited to meet the neighbor that she ran and pulled up a flower from the neighbor's flower bed and gave it to the neighbor. A very sweet thing, and the mother yelled at her and shamed her and told her, "What are you doing? That's not your flower. What's wrong with you?" That kind of thing. A little event, but that kind of indignity happening over and over and over again is what we call the cumulative trauma. And so, and just the fact that after many years, this still occurs to you that the family and eating is all that is related, suggests that there is, and even if it's not again on the trauma on the score of some of these others, the same mechanisms can be at work.
Yeah, I thought I should say something since I accidentally put up
That's
my
all
hand.
right. That's all right. No, I appreciate you being brave and bringing that up. Thanks, Paula. So you're welcome. So somebody in the chat, Teresa asks, is the edition of the book important? No, I think the one I have is also a 1996 edition. And I don't know that they even have put out a new edition. I mean, unfortunately, it's one of those. I think it's one of those Routledge books, which are usually too expensive, but it is worthwhile. It's a good book. So no, the edition doesn't matter. And Irene says, "Thank you for an informative introduction. I am wondering how best to attend the course. Is taking notes recommended while listening or simply concentrating? I was thinking track optics that might be triggers, yet I write a lot and don't want cognitive side to it." Well, that's really up to you. And the thing is, as I say, it'll be recorded. So if you want to just sit and and listen, you can do that. I also post the underneath the video. I'll post a copy of the PowerPoint, so you can that can work as notes for you, or you can go back and write notes afterwards if you just sit and listen. Or if it's comfortable for you to take notes, you can do that as well. It really is. It's an individual thing. Moira says, thank you so much. I don't think there's a question in there, but you're welcome, Moira. And so Linda says, after attending Callshed's workshops, I love how you are building out on other concepts. Love to take this course, just need to find some money. Well, I hope you do. It's gonna, once we do the course, it's gonna be up. So if you can't do it now, it will be up on the site and can be taken at any time. Neurofeedback through screen feedback as evidence of success with PTSD. Is that your understanding? Yes, not only neurofeedback through screen feedback, but there's something called EMDR, which we'll talk a little bit about. Also, eye movement sensibility. I'm not sure what all the different acronyms are about, but EMDR is the thing where you trace, you watch either someone's hand, or there's different online things that you can access where you think about traumatic things and let the memories come up, and then the cognitive mind is involved by watching this dot or watching someone's hands go back and forth. So that's another thing. It's another form of neurofeedback. It's kind of specific, but sure, yes. And as I say, something as simple as doing playing a sport with someone, or doing martial arts, or in my case, playing music along with other musicians. Those kind of things can all help to integrate all that different part of the brain. So I've run out of all the chat questions. Is anybody, in the case unless I missed somebody, does anybody else have a question or a thought? Paul, you had another question?
Oh, yeah. Do you think tapping is very helpful?
Well, one of the things, one of the methods of EMDR involves tapping. Is that what you mean? Where you do like this?
Okay.
Well,
I don't know.
it's a bilateral thing. Yeah. Well, it can be. I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar with all of those different techniques. I've done EMDR, and I think that can be very, very useful. But the main thing is, however you do it, the goal is going to be in touch with traumatic memory, and to move the body while the mind is able to process it in some sort of a concrete way. So that, again, the whole thing is trying to get all those three systems, the reptilian and the mammalian, and the reptilian being going out into the body itself. So the body, the limbic system, and the cognitive thinking brain, when they're all working in tandem, then those systems are being linked up again where they had previously been dissociated. So I just see Bernadette. Just as a question in here, I'm going to try to answer first. It says, Ernie says, so grateful for today's session. What times does the upcoming training meet? On Zoom, or is it pre-recorded? It's all on Zoom, and then it will be recorded. It's the same time as today, which I think it's 4 o'clock my time. I think it's 1 o'clock on the West Coast. And then it's, unless I forget, it's always recorded. And then it's put up by Monday. You'll find it on the Depth Psychology Academy website. What about the new stream of psychedelics, mushroom? I would have to say, at best, I'm not in favor of psychedelics. If you're working with somebody who really knows what they're doing, perhaps. I'm, for reasons that would be too complicated to go into, I'm actually opposed to people using psychedelics. But I've used plenty of psychedelics. I should, full disclosure, when I was a kid. But I follow a spiritual master named Meher Baba, and he said, do not use psychedelics, and so. For his, because of that, that's why I'm opposed to psychedelics. So so that's everything in the chat. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but C. Bernadette, did you have a question?
Hi, James. It's actually Charmel.
Oh, Charmel, I didn't recognize you. Ha.
I put it on Zoom.
Well, nice to see you again. Long time.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Thank you again. You're always so giving and informative with your
Well,
work.
thank you. And I love seeing your sweet little dog back there, too. Just sat down below you. So did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if any of these people endorse breath work.
Oh, of course. Yeah, no, it's central to all those things. Yeah. Absolutely. Now, the thing is, for example, Bessel van der Kolk talks about how when they were doing this work with, starting to do things like yoga and other stuff, he's right down the street from John Kabat-Zinn's center, and he would send people to the John Kabat-Zinn center, and where they do meditation with breath work and all that. And he said everybody flunked out. All the people he said they flunked out because, particularly if you got severe trauma, to just sit with the trauma without the body moving or anything, it's just too overwhelming. It's just too difficult. They become hyperactive, and the emotions are too intense. And best case scenario, they would start weeping or become angry or something. So he found that they work better with yoga because they're doing something, the body's going, and they're integrating, but they're not. It's not that there's anything. There's a lot of mindfulness exercises can be very useful, particularly if you're mindful when you're doing the movement things. But so, anyways, that's one aspect of that. But the breath work is absolutely it's the breath is the one thing that completely connects the in a strange way, because we can stop through an act of the will. We can stop our breathing, but eventually we'll pass out, and the body will then kick in the breathing. So there's this very interesting connection between the body and the mind in terms of breath. And so watching the breath and doing pranayama, which is the yoga breathing exercise, and doing yoga and good yoga teachers will usually encourage you to watch your breath while you're doing the yoga poses and all that. So absolutely, breath is very, very important.
Yeah, I received this, it's free from this woman on the internet. So it's 15 minutes of breath work laying down with music. And I have to say that for me, I think it's probably the most transformative exercise I've ever done, because it just gets my mind out of the way. The music is incredible. And I'll end up feeling pretty emotional. But I think I healed one small issue I had in my body, because I brought that in as an intention. And I don't know, for 15 minutes, like I said, I've just found it incredibly intense. I don't think I'd want to do it with other people.
Sure.
Because a lot of times, I'm just too shy, I guess. I don't think I would let my emotions. I wouldn't want my emotions to display to the other people in the class.
Yeah, no, it's inhibiting. Sure. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
But anyway, I was just wondering if these fellows that you're going to be mentioning in the books, if they mention breath work as a major thing to put the mind over here in the body, so that the soul can come in and integrate. Because I'm really into soul work these days. So the soul can come in and heal what needs to be healed, because the trauma stays in the body. At least that's what I've been working on for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well, again, from all of the research says that the whatever you do, however you do it, if you're getting the body and the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and the thinking brain working together, then you're doing something. And that means if you get really emotional, you want to be able to articulate that emotion. You don't want to just blubber and then dissociate again. Then you're still dissociated. You want to be able to maybe journal about it or think about it, or you may not want to do it in a group and tell everybody about it, because they may not want to. One of the problems with trauma is that people don't want to know about trauma. They'd rather not hear about trauma, especially if they've been traumatized and they're trying to repress it. So, but the thing is to be able to get all those things working in tandem. Whichever works for that is excellent.
Thank you again.
You're welcome. Good to see you again, Charmel. Thanks for asking.
Mm-hmm.
So I see Owner. Is that your name, Owner? You got your hand up? Or is that just the owner of this I think you're muted.
Yeah, hi, my name is John, and I was listening to your talk, and I've read a lot about Van der Kolk and trauma and all. However, a lot of people who have trauma
Hmm.
have dissociative identity disorder,
Hmm.
DID, and uh, I teach trauma actually at a MFT course, so
Hmm.
complex trauma. So Van der Kolk's book is good, but he never talks about the disassociated part. I
Hmm.
think, before my personal opinion, before we do any body work, we need to call that part inside the room and have a dialogue with it. The split of complex.
Hmm.
Because just working with the body blindly, you don't know what the complex is actually trying to do. Why has it become the guardian of the threshold? So you must invite the guardian in and have a conversation with it, like Jung's active imagination. Talk to that part.
Yeah, no, that's
What is it?
exactly what the call should. That's one of the reasons I wanted to bring these two together, because
What is
they
it?
don't
What
talk
is
about this inner
no,
world of
no,
trauma at
no,
all.
no,
They're
no.
all about body. I mean, there's one guy, trying to think of it, Ron Siegel,
Okay.
who does psychodynamic stuff with some of these other things. But most of these guys are much more embedded in, as you say, and this is great stuff that they've learned, but they need to be able to bring in things like what Kalshit has to say, what Jung has to say, and what you're saying about working with the complex, and because that's a part of this integration.
Right.
It's a part of the whole integration process, and they're missing such valuable things.
Valuable
And so
things.
that's what I'm trying to hope to cover some in the course. Yeah,
Also, Van der Kolk and all are biological psychiatrists, so
exactly. Yeah,
they're more interested in the body. But I think
yeah.
the psyche governs the. I think the body lives in the psyche, as Jung said. So the
Yeah.
body is governed by the psyche.
Well, that's even a spiritual question about whether are we a human body having a spiritual experience, or a spiritual being having a human experience, and so yeah, and Jung was at least willing to encounter, to ask those questions,
Mm-hmm.
even as just psychological data, even if you don't want to get into the metaphysics of it, just as where the brain can go, where the psyche can go in terms of questioning itself and all that. And these guys forget it; they don't want to hear about that at all. Yeah.
It frightens them. It
Yeah,
frightens
oh,
them.
absolutely. Well, they can't measure it. You
No,
can't measure consciousness. You can't do
no.
an experiment on it. I actually had dinner with this guy, Christoph Koch, who's one of the top guys who studies consciousness. And after years and years and years, all they can do is study what they call the neuronal correlates of consciousness. They put electrodes on the brain, and when I think good thoughts, certain part lights up. When I think bad thoughts, that's as far as they've gotten with consciousness. And there's very little appreciation for what was the original method, which William James. When you read William James, he
Right.
says our first method, first and always, is introspection, because we have the laboratory between our ears, and that's one of the things that dominated Jung's whole approach, was this idea of introspection. He was very interested in the scientific things, and that's what I'm trying to do, is trying, like Anthony Stevens also did that, trying to pay attention to what science has learned, but realize, as you say, they're within one box, and they don't want to go outside that box.
And science comes from the Latin word scientia, to know. If you know yourself, then you know basically the world, because you're a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Yeah,
So
but there's more to the world than what the thing is. You don't get tenure at a university
no,
if
of
you
course
try
not.
to do the kind of stuff that we're talking about,
I
and that's
understand that,
that's one of the main things.
but you might help the University of Life.
Yeah, well, you definitely will. That's why I'm teaching here and not at a university. Well, thanks, John.
All right, thank
Appreciate
you,
your
sir. Okay,
your
okay,
sure. Thanks for your contribution.
okay. Thank you.
Now, Isaac says, is there any information on intrusive paranoid active imaginations, or what I would describe as a waking dream being triggered by what is going on in the person's life at that point in time? Is there a visual process of integration that is happening, or is it just a negative symptom? Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of Jung would call that a kind of a if you're doing an active imagination, if you're doing something of that nature, and you're working on something, and an intrusive thought, or an intrusive, as you're calling it, paranoid active imagination comes in, Jung would identify that as a complex, and he would want to work with that, and as John is saying, talk to it, see what the roots of it are. And if it's so intrusive that it's making it difficult to function, then you want to work with somebody else who can help to regulate that. But generally, Jung would look at it in the context of that being a complex. And again, if you're doing an active imagination, then probably you're relaxing. You relax into active imagination, and so the psychic energy of the intention, the psychic energy of the will, is now dropping, and so the level of energy in the complex is now greater than the energy of the will, and so it begins to intrude. That's why it's actually intruding, because you're lowering your sort of focus. And I hope that response helps. So I've got lots of thank yous. I can see people are probably going to have dinner or lunch or something. But thank you all for coming. If you've got any more burning questions, let me know. If not, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you. I hope we see you at the course. And if not, I hope we see you on campus sometime at the Depth Psychology Alliance or the Depth Psychology Academy. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.